Have you ever wondered what your dreams mean? Join us in Dream School at thisjungianlife.com and find out. Jung wrote, "Dreams are a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul."
Dream School is a unique, self-paced online program you can start at any time that unlocks access to your inner world. Our 12-month program provides the support, knowledge, and guidance you need to reach within, decipher your personal dream code, and harness it to optimize your life. By enrolling, you'll join an affirming community of fellow travelers, each pursuing a unique quest.
And it's fun. Join us on an adventure to wholeness and healing through understanding your dreams. Go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Dream School. You'll be taken to our secure checkout. Once you join, you'll get immediate access to our first 3 modules. You can get started right away. We look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marchiano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marchiano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
We received a message from one of our listeners a couple of weeks ago and asked us to do a podcast on hunting. And it was not something that had occurred to us previously. The 3 of us do not have personal experiences hunting, but we acknowledge the fact that the archetype of the hunter is central. It shows up in all kinds of fairy tales, mythology, religion. And so we thought we would circumambulate the image and the archetype of the hunter. And I'd like to begin by just sharing a quote from Erich Fromm, his work, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. He writes, "In the act of hunting, the hunter returns to their natural state, becomes one with the animal, and is freed from the burden of his existential split, to be part of nature and to transcend it by virtue of his consciousness. In stalking the animal, he and the animal become equals, even though man eventually shows his superiority by use of his weapons."
I like that quote, Joseph. It really frames, I think, the territory that we want to enter. And I'm aware that in many indigenous cultures, hunting is an activity of great, I want to say, spiritual and mystical significance. And in a lot of these cultures, hunters would often engage in purification rituals before the hunt. The Native American Wabanaki tribe, these hunters knew the habits of the animals that they tracked intimately. And before beginning the hunt, they would seek to discover their quarry in a dream. So they would look to have a dream in which they would identify their prey. And that would be a sign that the animal would willingly submit to the kill. So I think this is really interesting because the dream sign points to a kind of participation mystique with the quarry. So like a mystical bond with the animal that's being hunted. And when you think about the implications of this, were an animal to submit willingly to a hunter's knife, the killing would then have a sense of some greater context, and the hunter would only be playing a small role, just the same way that the prey is playing a small role. Somehow, in that sense, the kill was meant to be and was not merely the hunter imposing his will on nature. And psychologically, this points to a deep partnership between ego and unconscious, where the ego lives in harmony with some unconscious instinct and is not inflated with its own power. So if we think about that sort of symbolically and what its meaning might be in a myth or a fairy tale.
In a way, I think what you're pointing to, Lisa, is that the hunt and the kill is transformative. Of that, if the hunter kind of represents the ego and the quarry represents the unconscious, what is transformed? Well, of course, the animal is killed. On the other hand, it then goes to feed the tribe. It goes to create new life.
Right. It's transformed into food.
Mm-hmm.
It is sacrificed. The thing about kind of indigenous hunting rituals is there was often a real religious significance to them. So, for example, there might be purification rituals for days in advance, and there would be prayers that would be said. And when the animal was killed, there might be more prayers, and the carcass of the animal was treated kind of reverently, so that it's this kind of profound partnership. In some cultures, the hunters sing songs of praise for the killed animal, or they use special honorific names and titles for them. There's a tribe in the Amazon that would salute their prey after death and sing for them. And Wales and British Columbia, but were addressed there by the indigenous people as queen and associated with special songs and rituals. So there's this reverence. I mean, in Central Asia, there were deer cults, and the shaman would dress up as a deer. And of course, deer was the main prey. So there was this way that the animal was both hunted and also revered.
So the killing, the hunt, is not just slaughter. It is elevated to a spiritual act through these rituals.
It's sacralized.
Yes, it is sacralized.
And the animal is sacrificing itself. It's being made sacred, and it becomes sacred food.
Yeah. So we're dependent on the earth in this way through its animal life. We're dependent on the earth to give us food. Joseph Campbell points out that we carry this recognition forward when we say grace before meals, that we are thanking the earth, the animal, the provider, the great mystery for giving us sustenance. And our sustenance depends on something else having died.
If we think about the Neolithic and Paleolithic world, human beings also observed hunting and the eating of meat in the animal world that they were part of. We know that hunting and gathering was a subsistence strategy that began 1.8 million years ago. And so as human beings who are part of the animal kingdom, by the way, our bodies, our own unconscious minds, and our observations told us or gave us strategies to survive. So hunting, the eating of meat when it was available, as well as foraging for what could be found to survive long enough to reproduce, to have children, is the underlying driving dynamism. I'm thinking about that book, Sapiens, by Yuval Harari, which I think all three of us have read sometime in the past because we chatted a little bit about it, in that the incredible influence that sapiens had on the environment through their hunting behaviors, that as groups of sapiens moved and explored from continent to continent, their hunting practices and their higher intelligence changed the natural environment, whether it's hunting the mastodons to extinction, or in a much more recent reality, hunting the dodo bird into extinction. That human beings have a ingrained potency to harvest from the environment what is required for them to survive, and beyond that, to thrive. It's something that we need to own, although we observe it obviously, and to be curious about that.
So let's build a little bit on that curiosity, which I certainly have, especially with the reference to the mastodons, which are so huge. So this hunting instinct goes beyond the need for sustenance, for food. There were many other animals that were more readily available. But there was something compelling about humans, sapiens, banding together to kill something this large, which certainly would be eaten. Nothing went to waste, but it's more than just we need food. And maybe your word, Joseph, about thriving starts to hit on this, a certain kind of inherent aggression, need for mastery, need to conquer comes into play here, another part of our nature as sapiens.
Perhaps, and maybe I'm about to say something that isn't really so different from what you've said, Deb. But I'm thinking about the Arthurian legend of the White Stag, and a white stag or a white hind is a common mythological motif. And in Arthurian legend, the creature was able to always evade capture, so you would give chase, but you would never be able to capture it. And it was believed that the pursuit of the animal represented mankind's spiritual quest. So there's this sense that hunting the elusive prey, whether it's a woolly mammoth or a white hind or perhaps a whale, is somehow deeply felt as a quest.
So it may tie in with the archetype of the hero and the need for ego in some way to surmount this archetypal enormity of the mastodon and the whale.
And then we're in this realm of projection, that everything around us, in a certain sense, is a blank screen, and our unconscious content that longs to be known is projected onto any number of these blank screens. So it is an interesting thing to ponder, and it may be unique to each hunter in the modern era. What is being projected onto the prey? And I would imagine that plays a part in the satisfaction of attaining it. I think this may be more relevant in trophy hunting because it is so explicitly outside the realm of consuming the animal, and it is about claiming some aspect of the animal for oneself or having triumphed over it. And that has something to do with how the ego perceives itself.
I think we're really in this realm of sort of what is the relationship between ego and unconscious. And somehow the imagery of hunting and perhaps the experience of it always seems to speak to that. So in some of these scenarios that we've talked about, there's this kind of mystical connection between the ego and the unconscious that feels life-giving and reverent. And in other scenarios, it's more about kind of the ego dominating, which is not necessarily always a bad thing, by the way, although it can be. I think, Joseph, you bring up trophy hunting, and that might be a case where it really is about the ego's need to dominate something. And we might kind of have a question about that. I'm thinking about the book Moby Dick and Captain Ahab's pursuit of the white whale. And of course, that brings about his ruin. And that is, I think, sort of a metaphor for a sort of hypertrophied ego attitude of dominance.
Part of the dominance also has to do with status, I would imagine, in terms of, again, the trophy hunting. Because there's a personal experience of finding a particularly magnificent animal, something that perhaps even has the capacity to harm the hunter, killing it, and then taking evidence back home that the hunter had been the one that had triumphed over this quote unquote monster, bringing that back home or to the tribe and having it stand in effigy as an example of the hunter's prowess, their courage, their ability to stalk and find, and that in some way that the trophy becomes an extension, a symbol of the hunter's prowess.
I'm relating this to the myths of the king must die, and in ancient times, a king's reign being time limited. In alchemy, when you cut off the lion's paws, figuratively speaking, or the eagle's wings, there is a way that it's the transformation, an old or inferior or outgrown ruling principle, and that to conquer a whale or a mastodon also represents a transformation of consciousness in the symbol of the trophy, more than just ego dominance.
Yeah, well, I think that goes back to something you said before, Deb. I think maybe we're in the realm of the hero at that point, who transforms the world in some way. And there are certainly stories, myths, fairy tales about a hero who is a hunter.
Oh, there are so many myths and fairy tales about hunting, from Actaeon to Adonis to Agamemnon. It goes on and on and on. The mythical prominence of hunting myths.
Well, and it must be because it's so part of just our very DNA, right? I mean, from early on in human history. I don't know exactly when. I wonder if there's someone out there listening who could shed some light on this. But when did we start hunting? When in our evolution did we start hunting? I think it was quite early.
And aren't we also very much related to much of the animal kingdom, where there are predators and prey of just its life itself? And I'm thinking that early hominids had to do something to survive. We didn't have claws. We didn't have wings. We didn't have speed. So we used our intelligence to hunt and to make it into an organized and then ritualized activity.
Mm-hmm. It was very much, I think, the social aspects that allowed us to be able to take down large prey. Mm-hmm. It was the fact that we
could cooperate.
Yeah.
And there is a survival dynamic in this, in as much as meat holds a substantial greater amount of energy than grass, for instance, does, or other vegetables, that human beings that had greater access to meat had a tendency to have more vitality, more physical energy, and that gave them a kind of evolutionary advantage. So in terms of our modern cultures preferring meat, which I know varies around the world, our evolutionary brethren who rejected or were less skilled at finding or acquiring meat were more likely to fail in the great competition of survival.
Protein
and iron too. Especially human women have a need for a ready source of iron because they menstruate and they lose a lot of iron. And red meat is a rich source of iron.
So taking a pivot, I'm thinking about the image of the hunter, as you guys had been mentioning a little bit ago. And the hunter shows up as a mediator between the kind of civilized, left-brained world of the castle and the court and the primal, unconscious, instinctive, right-brained part of us. So even though the queen wants to kill Snow White, and she wants the huntsman to do that, I find that very interesting, that the instinctive part of her own psyche that still has one foot in the civilized world of the ego and still has maintained another foot in the world of the forest is playing a substantial role in the unfolding of the drama. So if we think of a fairy tale as happening within one psyche, that the ego had to drop down into this instinctive level, one, to admit that she wanted to do something as primal as killing her stepdaughter, and in older versions, I believe, Lisa, you had said it was even her own biological daughter, that impulse comes from a much deeper irrational level. And the huntsman is the one that can activate that capacity. Interestingly, the huntsman is also the one who carries compassion because he doesn't kill her. The queen, who is so far away from the realities of hunting and killing, imagines that she can just decree that Snow White's heart will be brought back to her in a box. But the huntsman, who actually is in relationship to the forest, the living beings, including Snow White as a living being, is much closer to the reality of killing.
So the queen wants to, in effect, outsource her dirty work to the huntsman and thereby give it a kind of cover, if you will, of legitimacy. So now it's supposedly in the realm of legitimate hunting, but it isn't really. As you point out, the huntsman has compassion. He knows that truly to hunt, this must be a sacralized act in the interest of something truly legitimate in the service of life. And killing Snow White is not that.
Right. The huntsman is not an assassin.
Yes.
But those are very different archetypes.
And I think we've touched on that just a little while ago when we talked about trophy hunting, of when is hunting part of this archetypal great round of life and death, and when is it just in the service of grandiosity and I can mount this animal's head on my wall and show everybody what a lot of prowess I have. And Snow White makes that distinction also of where it is legitimate and archetypal in the service of something more, and when is it just vindictive or assassination. And for the queen, of course, her desire to kill Snow White is simply born of envy.
Right? There is actually no primal necessity to the killing of Snow White. It's simply for political gain. I think that in the modern culture, as people stand in various positions around hunting, that the archetype of the assassin can be, I think, incorrectly projected onto the hunting culture. Part of that, I think, is the struggle that we as moderns have with relating to the world of the forest, particularly those of us, myself included, who live in relatively urban environments, where we are very far away from how and where our food is produced. Most of us in the modern world have never been in a slaughterhouse or have ever participated in the slaughtering of livestock, and yet we're going to the steakhouse and enjoying that. But implicit in eating meat is that someone slaughtered that animal and transformed it through cooking into this thing that we like to eat. So the huntsman is the one who is able to bridge that modern and ancient world consciously and without avoidance. I'm also thinking that in some of the research that's been done with hunters, that most hunters are highly responsible. They're involved in conservation work. They experience this as an opportunity to participate in nature, to have a sensuous connection to the forest, to feel responsible for one's food, to experience a kinship to wildlife. I think when the archetype of the assassin is wrongly laid on the hunter, then he is decried as a despot in some way, as an agent of cruelty. But well-trained hunters have a very strong stance against cruelty. The swift dispatch of the animal is considered the skillful kill for the hunter. Some researchers have made some claims that are interesting. Boyd Eaton from Emory University and Marjorie Shostak write about this hunting gathering dynamic. And they put forward that denial of the hunting instinct can lead to a kind of psychopathology. And they claim that our hunting instinct has gone awry in civilized society, where the thrill of the chase and the kill are no longer part of our experience, and there are no clear avenues of expression, except perhaps to our peril in the streets and subways of today's urban jungle. That's quite a big statement to make, but I think they're saying something that Freud said very openly, that under the veneer of civilized ego consciousness, that we are full of howling beasts, this incredible instinctive unconscious. And while that feels very numinous, and it is, Freud was very clear that it's also dangerous.
You know, I was friends many years ago with a young man from France, and I no longer remember the details of the story, but I remember him telling me that he spent some time with an indigenous group in Africa, and he went with them on a hunt, and he said that it was the most sort of strangely transportative event, that he kind of became someone else, and he was just absolutely enthralled by the chase and sort of the joy of the bloodshed at the end. He said it was quite remarkable what happened to his psyche as he participated in this ancient activity. So I think there might be something to that, Joseph.
My friends who hunt have said privately, because I think it would be misunderstood, that when they have sighted their prey and successfully killed the deer, for instance, swiftly, that they experience a kind of euphoria, a transformation of consciousness. Perhaps this even plays a role in some part with ritual animal sacrifice, which was a major part of ancient religions. That there is some kind of a release of psychological energy in the process for some people, that dopamine release. And that also becomes a self-reinforcing cycle, giving hunters the experience of pleasure, but also puts us in that state of wonder. Why did the human psyche evolve in such a way that successfully killing the animal at the end of the hunt is rewarded by some level of the psyche? We could take an evolutionary standpoint and say, well, yes, because when that happened, one could predict that the tribe would survive, your family would survive, that you would survive, and that nature wants us to like to survive.
Well, there is a kind of egocentricity, a kind of dominance that I think is part of human nature, that success and in the killing of the quarry. And what Jung says is that kind of egocentricity is a necessary attribute of consciousness and is also its specific sin. And I think that speaks to the sacralization, the necessity for that in the hunt, that we have to set that kind of aggression, killing instinct, and egocentricity within a transpersonal or at least an impersonal frame of reference, lest it simply become slaughter.
So ritualizing anything adds a level of self-reflection, a level of ego choice, and even aesthetic around the behavior, which in a way slows it down so it doesn't become a kind of frenzy, a berserking frenzy of killing, but is a thoughtful, as you said, sacralized act. And I imagine the sacralization of the act also allows the hunter to transcend the grief or anxiety or remorse about the death of the creature.
Yeah, Joseph Campbell is very clear about all of that, that the guilt, the remorse, the grief, all of this is assuaged by the ritualization of killing and the hunt, the gratitude as well. So it has to be set within a larger archetypal frame. It cannot just be killing.
Yes, and at the same time, of course, killing has a place.
Yes.
Right? I'm sort of walking around the same idea, I think, and maybe just wanting to enter it from a slightly different way, because there's so much about this idea about kind of becoming one with the quarry. Kind of what I talked about earlier, the participation mystique. There's a film called The Great Dance, a hunter's tale, I think is what it's called, a hunter's story. The Great Dance, a hunter's story. It's from 2000, and it was directed by Craig Foster, who also made that wonderful film, My Octopus Teacher, that was on Netflix back a year or two ago. And it really follows these three Bushmen hunter trackers. And one of the things that I really got from the documentary was how intimately they know the landscape. They can read what happened. They can see how fresh the track was. They can construct a story. They know what happens to the track when it gets hit by a drop of rain. They see what happens to the track when a scorpion walks across the track, and then they know how old the track was. So it's these tiny refinements, but just being so in tune with the environment. It makes me think about the Grimm story, The White Snake, in which a king is very wise, and he receives this covered dish every day and eats in privacy and then covers it back up, and a servant takes it away. And one day the servant just can't resist. He's just so curious that he takes the dish away, but opens it to see what it is. And to his surprise, there's a white snake on the platter, and he can't help himself. He eats of it, and immediately he understands the language of the animals. And so he goes about his, he has, sort of good things happen to him because he knows things that other people don't know. But there's a whole sequence where he helps some fledgling ravens, some ants, and a fish. And of course, they all help him later gain the hand of a princess, which he eventually successfully does and lives happily ever after and everything. But the interesting thing is that the ants say, your horse is stepping on us, please move. And he does. He cares. There's this compassion that you were talking about, Joseph, with the hunter in Snow White. There's this compassion for the animals. But when the ravens don't have anything to eat, he slaughters his horse for the ravens. So it's the sense that there is a right time. There is a right time to do this. There is a right time to sacrifice something and to let it be transformed. But it requires a great deal of intimate knowledge of nature, of our nature, perhaps, to know when is the right time and what is the right thing to sacrifice. That's
very, very profound.
I think we are in the realm of the covenant. Here's a wonderful quote from Joseph Campbell, that the basic hunting myth is a kind of covenant between the animal world and the human world. And I think that's really lovely. And I have a quote from Henry Beston, who's well known on Cape Cod because he wrote about a year in this house on the beach in Eastham, the town next to where we live, called The Outermost House. And it speaks to the covenant between man and animal. And here it is. We need another and a wiser and perhaps a more mystical concept of animals. Remote from human nature and living by complicated artifice, man in civilization surveys the creature through the glass of his knowledge and sees thereby a feather magnified and the whole image in distortion. We patronize them for their incompleteness, for their tragic fate of having taken form so far below ourselves, and therein we err, and greatly err. For the animal shall not be measured by man. In a world older and more complete than ours, they move, finished and complete, gifted with extensions of the senses we have lost or never attained, living by voices we shall never hear. They are not brethren, they are not underlings, they are other nations, caught with ourselves in the net of life and time, fellow prisoners of the splendor and travail of the earth. And this quote was on the wall of one of the rooms at the Ethical Society building in Philadelphia, where all three of us trained, and I wrote it down one day. And then I read the book by Henry Beston, The Outermost House.
Yeah, that's a lovely quote, and it makes me think of that fascinating documentary about animal communication, which I believe, it's been a long time since I've watched it, but I believe that she addresses this kind of tracking that hunters do, and even speculates that our ability to communicate with animals and this kind of participation mystique. I think that's the third time I've said participation mystique today, which is really a fun thing to say.
And anyway, such a good French accent.
Bien sûr. But in any case, that this ability may have evolved because it was fundamental to a successful hunt. This ability to kind of sense where an animal was or what it was thinking, or was it heavy on its feet?
The unconscious to unconscious connection that Jung writes about, that we are wired for with one another. And we have largely lost that ability to relate to animals in the natural world that way. But this person from South Africa, Anna Bredenbach, I hope I have her name correct, we'll put it in the show notes, has the ability to track animals in this way and speaks about seeing a path that is kind of lit up ahead of her. This is a capacity that we have, and it is our heritage way back in our primal past, our archaic roots, as Jung would call them.
So we're in the realm of the instincts.
Fromm also makes another distinction in his work, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, and he points out that the motivation of the modern ethical sport hunter is pleasure, which is fused with some degree of compassion. And he contrasts that sharply with the motivation of the sadist, who might also torture and kill pets or other small animals, but that rises up from the desire for revenge. So predatory aggression, or hunting, is seen from that psychoanalytic lens as a positive form of aggression, like sports or play, where the primordial energies are then rising up and are conditioned by a sport that has certain limits and certain skills that have to be developed. Just the fact that in the United States we have hunting seasons and they have to be obeyed. They're kind of legally sanctioned periods within which the spirit of the hunter is welcomed into the forests, and other times where the spirit of the hunter must be put away. And this ability for the culture to decide and to frame when the archetype is welcomed and when it's not, as well as various limits as to what kind of prey, the age of it, the size of it, is considered reasonable relative to the management of the creatures in the environment.
I thought it might be interesting to take a look at how hunting appears in some myths and fairy tales. And of course, there are so many fairy tales that feature hunters. And we've already talked a little bit about Snow White. But one of the ones that came to my mind was the fairy tale, The Six Swans. And I'm going to read just the first couple lines of the tale. So here's how it starts. A king was once hunting in a great forest, and he chased his prey so eagerly that none of his men could follow him. As evening approached, he stopped and looked around and saw that he was lost. He looked for a way out of the woods, but he could not find one. Then he saw an old woman with a bobbing head who approached him. She was a witch. So his hunt, his pursuit of the prey, has led him deeper and deeper and deeper into the forest, so deep that he can't get out. It's interesting to wonder about that the sort of the psycho-spiritual pursuit represented by the hunt led him into the deep interior, and now he's kind of stuck there. He's going to need some help getting out, and it's really going to cost him. It kind of sets up the rest of the story.
Yes. What I'm thinking about here is how the king seems to have simply been wanton in his chasing so eagerly after the prey, and didn't maintain a kind of necessary watchfulness, or just call it consciousness. And the forest is one of the great symbols of the unconscious. And if you just go galloping recklessly into the unconscious, some difficult things can befall you. The unconscious, the hunt needs to be undertaken thoughtfully, strategically, ritualistically, sacralized, as we've talked about before. You don't just go charging in there the way this king did. I would like to really go in a different direction here, thinking about the possible desacralization of the hunt that most of us, I think, experience every week when we go grocery shopping and buy all kinds of animal products, fish, poultry, pork, beef, etc., packaged, butchered, wrapped in plastic, all very hygienic. And I'm certainly not making the point from a moralistic place, but what is that like psychologically? That's something that was once so central to the life of the tribe and had such psychological significance has become just routinized. It's way distant from anything resembling the hunt.
One thing that strikes me is how going shopping at the supermarket is stripped of any exalted feeling. In fact, most people kind of groan with the burden of having to go shopping yet again, that it's so anti-numinous for most of us. That its connection to the hunt has been extracted successfully.
Yes.
I don't know, yeah.
And we might say the same thing about the field, that we buy grains and produce and, everything in the supermarket. It is very, very distant from its natural origins. Maybe that is just a reflection.
And a curiosity about where did that go? Because as we know, the archetypes don't leave. Archetypes are eternal, whether or not they're active in an obvious way, or whether they're kind of rumbling under the surface. One place that I suspect this hunting instinct has gone is into the world of gaming, that there are all kinds of behaviors that people might feel ambivalent about in the physical world, that we've become so refined that we wouldn't do this or that. But in the world of gaming, killing is often a central dynamic in video games. And I think the popularity of that speaks to the need that the psyche has to somehow brush against that archetype. Although I need to say that the war game of hunting the enemy is quite different than hunting game for food.
I'm thinking that maybe for women, it goes into bargain hunting. Not that it's unique to women, but we haven't talked at all about how very much in the masculine realm, hunting in its literal ways has been for millennia. And yet women have the same urge to seek.
To bag a bargain.
Well, I think women who did a lot of the planting and the gathering, in a way, that's another form of hunting, to hunt for the berries or the seeds or the roots.
Yeah, it has such a different energy, though.
More internal versus the aggressive external killing weaponry of hunting. They're maybe they're heads and tails of the same coin, but one is more an internal, more peaceful, quieter kind of energy. But we are seeking creatures.
You know, I'm thinking about one of the themes that's come up today is sort of what it is we're hunting when we hunt, and how sometimes it's this thing of transpersonal value. And there's a poem that I came across that speaks to that. So I'm going to share that. It's called Hunting Manual by the poet Eleanor Wilner. The unicorn is an easy prey. Its horn in the maiden's lap is an obvious twist. A tamed figure, like the hawk that once roamed free, but sits now fat and hooded, squawking on the hunter's wrist. It's easy to catch what no longer captures the mind, long since woven in. A faded tapestry on a crumbling wall, made by the women who wore keys at their waists, and in their sleep came hot dreams of wounded knights left bleeding in their care, who would wake the next morning groaning from the leftover lance in the groin, look up into the round blonde face beaming down at them thinking, mine, and say, angel. Such beasts are easy to catch. Their dreams betray them, but the hard prey is the one that won't come bidden. By these signs you will know it. When you lift your lure out of the water, the long plastic line will be missing its end. The lure and the hook will be gone, and the line will swing free in the air, so light it will be without bait or its cunning, sharp curl of silver. Or when you pull your net from the stream, it will be eaten as if by acid, its fine mesh sodden shreds. Or when you go at dawn to check your traps, their great metal jaws will be wrenched open, the teeth blunt with rust as if they had lain for years in the rain. Or when the thunderstorm suddenly breaks in the summer, next morning the computer's memory will be blank. Look then for the blank card, the sprung trap, the nets dissolve, the unburdened line that swings free in the air. There, by day, go empty-handed to the hunt and come home the same way in the dark.
So maybe that's a perfect time to transition into a dream. Hey, Lisa, what's been going on about your book?
Well, as you know, my book, Motherhood, Facing and Finding Yourself, was published in May of 2021 by Sounds True. And since it's been published, I've been feeling most excited and grateful reading the reviews for the book on Amazon and Goodreads. It makes me realize that this journey, which began as a challenging personal inquiry for me, has become a real healing force for many. Motherhood won the Parenting and Family category of the Best Book Awards this year through the American Book Fest, which has been exciting too. But what really feels nourishing to me as an author is hearing what's happening on the ground in people's hearts. And so many people have written to me in email or on social media and let me know how much the book has meant to them. And there's just nothing more gratifying than that, than to hear that the book has meant so much to so many people. So Motherhood is available wherever books are sold in paperback, ebook, and audio formats. And I hope everyone who's meant to dive into the well of its lessons can do so. And I so appreciate hearing from people what they think of it. So keep the emails and the letters and the comments coming. They mean a lot to me. There's also a free course that's related to the book and a book excerpt on my author website, which is lisamarciano.com. And I encourage all of our listeners to check it out. So thank you for asking, Joseph.
I'm just so happy for you. And it's such a lovely, lovely book, both deep and accessible, about the inner journey around being a mother. It's never been written about. It hasn't been out there. And it's getting such an enthusiastic, heartfelt reception. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I would love it if listeners who've read the book could write a review on Amazon, because although there are many wonderful ones there, more is always better. So thanks in advance for that.
You've really incarnated something that was in the ethers, but needed to be pulled down, needed to be shaped in words, and needed to be made accessible. Mm-hmm. And the proof in the pudding is that it's beginning to have a kind of life of its own in the collective.
Yes.
And that speaks a lot to the timeliness of this.
Yeah, I think you're right, Joseph.
The analogy to a baby is just too rich and too good and too multifaceted to be missed. It's having a life of its own, which is just what we want.
That's right.
We'd like to remind our listeners that we have created an online learning platform called Dream School, where you can learn how to analyze your own dreams, participate in self-created dream groups, to access training material that we have created for you, and to become increasingly proficient at identifying the secret and essential messages that your dream maker is encoding in your dreams each night. It's well worth the effort. Today's dreamer is a 27-year-old male who works as a construction worker. The dream is rather long, so you might wish to take a look at the show notes that accompany the podcast to be able to work on it with us. My extended family were in the process of relocating to a city named Boreham Wood in Tunisia. It was a sort of fairy tale paradise, blue skies, palm trees, and low-standing terracotta houses. They asked me to help with the move by driving my grandma's electric scooter from Scotland through the desert. Strapped to the sides were 2 bags filled only with ice and rum. Once I arrived to the new house, I unloaded the alcohol, but immediately felt the urge to leave and explore the area. It was clear my family wanted to celebrate my highly anticipated arrival, but I knew I couldn't stay. Instead, I took the scooter and drove into town, winding through the cobbled streets past Gothic arches and flocks of tropical birds. As I approached the city center, a large, dark castle rose into the skyline. At the gates, a young woman was weaving mushrooms from a hook to sell to tourists. I stopped and watched her, but didn't buy anything. I parked the scooter and entered the castle gates. The courtyard was bustling with young families eating lunch from long tables. I wandered around until I stumbled upon a group of disheveled-looking men dressed in gray robes and animal furs. They didn't pay me much attention, but I was fascinated and struck up a conversation with what appeared to be the leader. He explained that they were a tour group from America called Warriors of the Soul. that had been doing annual trips to Boreham Wood since 1992. I could see they had self-inflicted cuts all over their arms, some openly bleeding onto the table. The leader explained that they were mostly vets, recovering addicts, and environmental protesters who were on a journey of healing together. I asked the leader if I could spend the day with him and was immediately invited back to a tower in the castle to see his studio. We left the group and walked to the base of the tower. From there, we climbed a seemingly endless spiral staircase, dilapidated and strewn with trash bags. I remember taking note of the exit signs. Once at the top, I was ushered into the studio. It was dark, cold, and filled with primitive paintings made from human blood. He drew his knife and explained that the canvases were waxed paper, and that allowed the blood to move freely across the surface, unlike regular paper, which is far too absorbent. He then asked if I would donate blood for his next painting. At that point, I noticed a dead body under the drawing desk and tried to move the conversation back to the wax paper. I asked if the toxins were harmful if used when baking. This seemed to work as he began extolling that, yes, never use wax paper when baking. At this point, I turned on my heels and ran back down the stairs, bounding 3 at a time. He sprinted after me, brandishing the knife and laughing. I knew I'd be safe if I got to the exit signs, but they didn't appear. Instead, the staircase began to climb again, twisting and turning like a rabbit warren. He started gaining on me and nicked my thumb with the knife, but eventually I came to a window with a Brooklyn-style fire escape. I smashed the glass and shimmied down the ladder, my legs numb and bleeding. As I descended, he laughed at me continuously. Once on the ground, I ran back to the scooter only to realize I didn't know how to get home. I couldn't call because I didn't have my phone, and I couldn't buy any bandages for my cuts as I didn't have a wallet. Then I woke. As some context, he writes, in 2012, I left a broken home and migrated to a major American city. However, amidst the pandemic, the pull of my family and the time we've lost has begun to weigh on me. So much so, I recently decided to move back and have already paid a deposit on a room. Although I haven't left yet, the reality of this decision to leave a life I've been building for 10 years is truly beginning to set in. I have a complicated relationship to home, and moving back sometimes feels like a sign of defeat. His main feelings in the dream were anxiety and wonder. And he adds, I'm not a veteran or recovering addict, but I'm supportive of green energy and keeping the planet clean.
Well, as you said, Joseph, it is a longer dream, and there is a lot of imagery in it. And so my tendency is to want to kind of go for the overarching story, the main arc of the narrative. And to me, it seems like it's a bit of a hero's journey kind of dream. We have this trial of driving the scooter through the desert. And then we have the journey to the center. So it's interesting because he goes to join his family, but he doesn't stay. He wants to go explore, and he goes toward the center of the city, and there he finds this castle, I think it is. In the castle awaits this transformative adventure. So it's a real scenario. It's an image of a real encounter, I think, with the depths of the psyche. There's this anima figure stringing the mushrooms, and then there are these, kind of gnarled men, the warriors of the soul, who are making the sacrifice. They're bleeding on the table. They've got self-inflicted wounds. They're able to make the sacrifice that later he is not quite ready to make.
Well, if we take those two movements, it's interesting that he starts with this relocation with the family, and then he shifts to the center of the castle and this opportunity, I think, for male initiation. So I'm imagining at 27 that he's negotiating in this hero's journey with leaving home, leaving the safety of the parental opinions, leaving the familiarity of the rituals and values that he was raised with, and going to this darker center place in him where the masculine is seeking some kind of a healing process. I'm struck by the self-inflicted cuts on the men's bodies. There's a number of ways I imagine we could orient to that. On one level, it could be seen as a kind of self-harm. And if this man was Maya Nalisand, we might explore in what ways he might be harming himself, not explicitly with cutting, but perhaps in some other ways to bring that to consciousness. But I'm also thinking about the flagellati. In some of these more ancient traditions of inflicting pain on oneself as a kind of purification process, as a demonstration of one's ability to maintain equanimity in the face of suffering.
Well, and self-wounding can also be an aspect of initiatory rituals. And there is something initiatory going on in this dream, I think. And I think, and he's seeking it. He's seeking the initiation, and he finds the leader and is invited into the innermost tower. The tower is can be an image of the self. And he's taken into this kind of, innermost chamber, and there he learns the great secret. And the great secret is you will need to sacrifice. There's a dead body on the table, and he is being asked for his blood. And he's not quite prepared to make that yet, but I think that he's different after this dream. His thumb has been nicked. If this were a fairy tale, that would be the sort of fateful thing. Thumb's been nicked. He can't go back to the way it was before. And he can't find the scooter. I guess he finds the scooter, but he doesn't know the way home.
I'm thinking about this dream as taking place in 3 acts. Act 1 is everything is wonderful with the fairy tale paradise of Tunisia with palm trees and blue skies. And then Act 2 is he stumbled upon a group of disheveled men dressed in gray robes and animal fur. So we've really got an image of the sort of instinctual primitive man here. Now, they call themselves Warriors of the Soul, but they're a tour group from America. And there's an implication here in his references that he's moved to America from another country, and he's now moved back. And despite their strange appearance and these self-inflicted cuts, he asks the leader if he could spend the day with him, and is invited to see the studio. And all this bloody stuff is in the service of art. That's what they do. They make paintings from blood. And I would be very, very curious about this particular image, the castle, the tower, and it's dark, cold, and filled with primitive paintings. So there's some return to some part of him that has moved, maybe in conjunction with moving back to his country of origin. He says he moved back, and what that's about. And I like your point too, Joseph, about this being an initiatory rite. And primitive initiation rites can be very bloody and life-threatening. It is not a cute or friendly process in many cultures, including fraternity houses in the United States. But that's just an aside.
And as we like to point out, the dreamer's 27. So he's just going into his Saturn return. So it's the right time for an initiation. I also thought it was interesting that, when he realizes what's being asked of him, that yes, you were being asked for a sacrifice here, or you're about to be asked. He tries to move the conversation to the topic of wax paper. So it feels a little bit like a move toward a regressive restoration of the persona. Let's just talk about the wax paper instead of dealing with this very heavy thing that's being required of me. Let me refuse the call in a way. It's the refusal of the call, or even Christ in Gethsemane saying, take this cup, let this pass. I would rather not do this. I would rather talk about wax paper than have to open up a vein here and give you some blood.
So he starts, to run and tries to escape, but he's bleeding from his thumb. So he has this little wound that he takes with him in his flight. And I'm thinking of the fairy tale, Lisa, maybe you can come up with the name, where the protagonist, the hero, has to go on this great, long, convoluted journey. And he eventually attains his goal, but has to escape the castle, and the door closes and nicks his heel.
Yeah, that's the water of life.
Very much like that he has not escaped unscathed. On the other hand, he hasn't been, life-threateningly wounded either.
When I think about the encounter with the dead body, it seems to me that that's also part of the initiation, particularly moving out of one's 20s and forward. It's the whole idea of memento mori, that in many of the paintings of the Enlightenment, you would see a skull. That there's something about the second half of life for all of us that we are tasked with thriving under the shadow of death. When we're very young, of course, we feel like we're going to live forever. We may have never known anybody who's passed away, and that death is very far from us. But in this initiation and in the process of leaving the paradisical fantasies of the home and moving into the world, and for him, the world of men, this involves an acceptance of death, his own mortality and the mortality of others. We could say an awful lot about blood. It's a symbol that shows up over and over again. It has something to do with life. It's red. It has something to do with Mars through its redness. So this donating of his blood to the initiatic event, which he is ambivalent about, that he doesn't want the initiation to cost him, and then wants to flee when he realizes there will be a cost.
Right.
The nick on the thumb, I think, is fantastic, and thank goodness, because even though he's fleeing this initiation, the archetypal initiator is able to do a little bit of something. The nicking reminds me of circumcision. And in some Jewish synagogues, when somebody wants to convert to Judaism, if that's permitted by the congregation and by the rabbi, he may, if he's a man, he may have what's left of his foreskin nicked by the rabbi as a kind of symbolic circumcision, which is part of this covenant between the Jew and God. So I think about the little nick on his thumb as this symbolic circumcision that's part of his transformation from youth into manhood. And even though he flees and is wildly disoriented by the process, the dream is demonstrating that one way or another, you're going to go on this journey of growth. And either we can run towards the journey and bring all of our skills with us, or we're going to be dragged on the journey by our hair, or in this case, by his thumb.
That's great.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.